This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 11th and January 12th, 1888, a massive blizzard sweeps across the U.S. Great Plains, starts in Canada, through the Dakotas and Nebraska, over to Minnesota and Wisconsin. As we'll discuss, though, it really touched much of the United States. People were ice skating in San Francisco. There were some reports of that. But the blizzard and the extreme cold is remembered not mostly for the area that it covered, but for its death toll. In the end, some 235 people died in this storm, one of the deadliest winter storms on record, and a great number of those people who lost their lives were children, school children, many of them stuck at school or trying to get home from their schoolhouses. The deaths of the children was such a defining story coming out of this that this became known as the, quote, Children's Blizzard of 1888. So let's talk about that, the Children's Blizzard, the Schoolhouse Blizzard. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson is not with us today. She has, as I think you heard last episode, she had knee surgery to ring in the new year. She's recovering, not taping this week, but we wish her well. She will be back soon. So we'll do it, Nikki and I. I think all of us on the team here, when we found this story, had the reaction of like, why in the world would you call this the school kids blizzard?
Because it actually sounds kind of jolly, right? Like,
Possibly.
oh, the schoolhouse blizzard. And then you read the story and you're like, oh, well, this is awful.
Yeah, it's because kids were trapped inside their schoolhouses. But we will get to that and why that was a kind of defining story of this blizzard. But I kind of want to paint this bigger picture that I've had in my mind around this story, which is, you know, these kind of two forces colliding in a way in the American plains and from different directions. So from east to west, we have the pioneers, right? Coming, covered wagons, settling in these new territories, sweeping in, and then sweeping in from the north and the west is this weather, and not just this storm in particular, but kind of a fierce climate. And especially this blizzard comes at the end of a kind of decade of really, really awful, brutal weather. And so, you know, I think obviously pioneer life is hard, but it just strikes me as really like the timing, so to speak, and these two forces colliding of people moving west and brutal, brutal weather settling into this territory. It means a moment like this feels almost fated.
It feels almost fated, and it feels like there are these big forces outside of your control that are shaping your life. Right. And I think that's what life was like on the Great Plains to begin with. But then you have this little ice age that you were talking about, Jody, which is a real phenomenon that really messed with people in the United States during the 1880s, a tumultuous time of economic upheaval, of panics and depressions. But you also have this period of cooling that happens. It happens in part because far away in Indonesia, a volcano explodes and it puts ash in the air, and that actually cools the overall temperature of the earth for several years. And that's devastating for crops in some places. It's great for crops in other places. But it also means that you have this tumultuous and kind of unexpected weather that is going to create crises like this, these blizzards that not just come in and bury these areas in feet of snow, but that come on very unexpectedly, right. As was the case with this blizzard.
Yeah, I just got to say, the school children's blizzard at the end of the Little Ice Age. We got to, this diminutive, infantilizing language has got to go. I mean, these are real. Yeah, but yeah, it is fascinating that, you know, 1882 to 1888 is this, the globe is really in this deep freeze. And, you know, people have written that this blizzard is kind of the exclamation point at the end of a really brutal, tumultuous era for climate, especially in this region. Before we get to the storm itself, I guess the other picture to paint, I mean, I think people understand pioneer life, but, you know,
we all watched Little House on the Prairie. We know what's happening here.
Right. But you'll see why this comes into play. But like a lot of these homes and schoolhouses were built fairly hastily, right? We're talking about a people who are kind of on the move, homesteading, setting up camp in a sense. And so it means that the structures that are built for a lot of folks, a lot of these people who are newly arrived in this area, are just not up to snuff to face this kind of weather.
Right. The structures are sort of slapdash. And also, we'll talk about this more too, but you're in these very small communities where people live long distances from one another. And, the 1880s, you're starting to get like transcontinental telegraph, but you're not getting information on the daily. Like, you're obviously not getting television or radio, but like, you're not getting necessarily newspapers every day. You're not getting kind of the news from the town. You might go into town and stop by the telegraph office, but that's the only way that you're getting any sort of current news and events about things like, what the weather forecast looks like.
And so, there is a weather forecast that says, and it comes from Lieutenant Thomas Mayhew Woodruff in St. Paul, Minnesota, and keep that lieutenant part in your head because I think that plays into this story a little bit. But, there are reports that a cold wave is indicated for Dakota and Nebraska tonight and tomorrow. The snow will drift heavily from today into tomorrow in the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. But again, who is seeing that in a matter of 24 hours? How is that information getting disseminated? And that's the other really big element here is speed, right? And in addition to the severity of the temperatures, and some of these kind of temperature stats are just incredible, but the way that it came in basically completely unexpectedly on the heels of a relatively warm day. I mean, just all of these things sort of conspire, but it's basically in a matter of hours, the temperature plunges, and in a matter of hours during the day. And that's where you have school children are already at school. People are already at work. People are not home. Parents have gone off to work. Kids have gone off to school, or parents have gone into the fields. And people are separated into their various little smaller groups. And then this storm just rolls in. And I mean, some of these stats about the way that the temperature plunges is just incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, imagine this. It's a January day. You're in the Plain States. So it's cold. Like, we're not talking about it being 80 degrees out, but, it's above freezing. Your kids have gone to school. Parents probably aren't working out in the home. They're probably working in fields, or some might work at stores and things. But it's a pretty normal day that doesn't seem to portend bad weather. But as this front comes through, as that very cold air meets the unusually warm air, suddenly you get this storm, and suddenly you get temperature drops. It could be anything from maybe it's a 40-degree day to a minus 20-degree day. And you can, that's a catastrophic drop in temperature. You're not prepared for
40 to minus 20.
Minus 20. I mean, that's a 60-degree drop. Other places have said it fell nearly 100 degrees. That seems unlikely, but it could have like a minus 40 in a place like North Dakota, which that would not be an unheard of temperature for that area. But now you have people who are stranded, right? These kids who are, as you've mentioned, in school, people who are out in the fields or out at work, where not only do you have this suddenly very, 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 very cold weather, but you have whiteout conditions. The storm comes in, the snow and the ice come in as these two fronts meet, and suddenly you can't see in front of your face. I don't know if our listeners have ever been in a real blizzard before, but when you have whiteout conditions, you cannot see a foot in front of you, and that makes getting it very easy to get disoriented if you're out in that weather, to get turned around. And once you get turned around, there's no landmark that you can see that can get you back on track. And you're in deadly cold conditions. And that's what makes this such a dangerous moment.
I mean, some of the stories, especially about the school children who perish in this, bear out what you were just describing. I mean, there's one story about a teacher who was stranded in her schoolhouse with 3 children and tried to take them out and lead them to their home, which is 90 yards from their school in Plainfield, Nebraska, and they don't make it. They get disoriented. They get turned around. There's other stories of people who hole up for, a day or two in their schoolhouse, have to burn wood for heat, and eventually get rescued. But, it seems like anyone who tried to venture out into these conditions perished, but also staying inside these ramshackle schoolhouses was not going to really be going to turn out much better anyway.
If you didn't have wood to burn, something to burn it with, if you didn't have a way to stop the wind from coming in and blowing out the fire, you were liable to freeze to death. And again, because of these whiteout conditions, I mean, the stories we have of people who were rescued and survived were ones where parents or teachers tied a rope around a tree and followed that rope so that they wouldn't get lost and disoriented, so that they could always return to home base if they got turned around. And that speaks to how unnavigable these conditions were. If you didn't have resources on hand in order to navigate it, you were out of luck.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
These numbers, right? I think people understand, 235 people dying. There's some estimates, in the end, it's over 1,000 who die because of disease and infection and the kind of aftermath of this. I mean, those are kind of big, stunning numbers regardless. But obviously, when we're talking about communities that are of a couple dozen people,
right,
it's worth pointing that out too. And so, there's a town in Yankton, which is now in South Dakota. It's the Dakota Territory at the time there. But, the Minneapolis Tribune reports that about 100 people lost their lives within 50 miles of Yankton. I mean, I don't know how many settlers lived within 50 miles of Yankton, but I can't imagine
not many.
How much. I would imagine that 100, is a real loss. So it's kind of remarkable.
It is. I mean, these are sparsely populated areas. Certainly there are indigenous people who live there, but the pioneer communities, white communities in these areas were not big bustling cities. We're not talking about East Coast cities. We're not even talking about places like Chicago. These are frontier areas for these white settlers. And so it's not a ton of people. And so as a percentage of the folks who are living out on the plains, it's a pretty significant death toll.
And so the plains feels this, obviously, most severely. But, as I said, this kind of the whole country feels this. There's reports, I mentioned this in the intro, that people are ice skating in San Francisco, frozen water mains in Los Angeles. There's towns in Texas that registered 7 degrees below freezing. Parts of the Colorado River in Texas froze over for the first time in anyone could remember. Pretty wild. Down into Veracruz, Mexico, there's reports of frigid temperatures. So one other element here, and I can hear a friend of the show, Harry Enton, who's the biggest weather nerd I know, going, talk about how this changed the art of forecasting, right? And that's a huge part here of the story as well, too, which is really fascinating. And probably kind of one of the biggest legacies of this is, we mentioned how obviously it's related to communication, and, there's barely telegraph, obviously no internet, no radio at this moment. It's hard to disseminate information anyway, but it does seem in the wake of this and another blizzard in 1888 that hits the East Coast, in the wake of those two, there does seem to be a real conversation about the state of weather forecasting in this country, who controls it, and how information about these kinds of events does get disseminated.
Because at this time, weather forecasting was being done by the military. It's the Army Signal Corps that is deciding about this. It's a cold wave warning, and then they decide not to actually send out the warning. They don't send out a warning about that blizzard the next year that you're talking about. So something about both the forecasting models and the decision-making process that's happening within the military in this weather bureau there, it's not working for people, right? They're not calling the shots in a way that make people feel good about the ability to be warned in advance of severe weather events. And so the government reorganizes. And 2 years later, in 1890, President Benjamin Harrison puts the Weather Bureau in the Department of Agriculture. And that's kind of where it lives going forward. And that does seem, there's kind of like a civil defense side to the military that maybe makes sense. But I think it makes more sense to have this in the Department of Agriculture, where there's more of a focus on science and scientific method and that kind of approach to making sense of what's happening with weather and how to alert people to what's going on weather-wise.
I think I agree, and I sort of, the logic of moving this into its own bureau and then under a different department makes sense. We got to go look up the number of times that something's been taken away from the Army. Big
right.
responsibility. It's not that many, I would imagine, right?
By the time we get to the 20th century, it looks very different.
Right. Yeah, it's more like, well, the Army can handle this, or we can make everything else feel a little more militaristic and like how the Army would do it. But it is so fascinating that that this got taken away, out from under Army jurisdiction in this moment. That seems
I think
rare.
It just speaks to a very different moment in military-civilian relations in the United States. The military just doesn't have that same kind of all-consuming presence and prestige that it would have in the 20th century, right? Like, we now look to the military both as a bottomless money pit, but as a source of innovation, right? We expect all of these new innovations to come out of the military, and those military innovations will then have civilian uses, and huzzah, let's continue to feed the military machine. I'm not going to say the military wasn't lionized to a certain extent in the 19th century, but it is nothing like it would be in the 20th century.
Yeah. So other little tidbits of legacy from this. I mentioned in March of 88, there's that big blizzard that hits the Northeast. I mean, go look up photos of that. I think it was like 55 inches in New York of snow in New York City. I mean, it's massive. And January in the Midwest, March in the Northeast puts severe winter storms on the map, so to speak, in this moment. But that's actually, I think, the moment when Boston decided that, we got to put our trains underground. And that's where you get underground trains from. In the Midwest, I mean, no surprise, I suppose, but in the wake of this storm, there's a big conversation about the construction, particularly of schoolhouses, and new, sturdier schoolhouses for kids are built in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. And the kind of aftermath of this, it really lives. I mean, there's in the 40s, there was a group in Nebraska of older people who tried to do an oral history and sort of compile some of the stories of this moment. It's clear that, like, even, 50 years later, the legacy of this, I mean, I don't think it's a huge overstatement to say this was a sort of equivalent day to what a September 11th would have been, or a December 7th, 1941. I mean, it was a day that scarred a region and kind of lived with a couple generations of people. And then we should give a shout out to this writer, David Laskin, who's written a bunch in the New York Times, written a bunch of great books. He's the one in 2004 who wrote a book that I think was called The Children's Blizzard. He was written beautifully about both the event itself, but also the way it kind of had an impact on the region. But that, I think, maybe cemented that name, the Children's Blizzard.
So if you're looking for someone to blame,
No, don't blame David Laskin. It was a good book and, a good title. So there you go. I think we will leave it there in terms of the 1888 Children's Blizzard. But since we are talking about January 11th, let's do some also on this days for January 11th. So in 1861, Alabama became the fourth state to withdraw from the Union. We've done a bunch of episodes about the kind of fits and starts and interesting ways in which states decided to dissociate in that time period over the course of that year.
And in 1964, U.S. Surgeon General Luther Terry issued Smoking and Health. This was a report that concluded, just to quote from it, cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate. He intentionally releases this memo on January 11th, 1964, which was a Saturday, so that it would limit its immediate effect on the stock market, always looking out for the people's health, that Surgeon General.
Hey, the stock market's health is the people's health. Don't you know?
Health
that?
of the economy is the health of the people.
Anytime we mention smoking on this show, I will just point out that one of my absolute favorite episodes we've ever done was with Sarah Mylov, is that who wrote a book about the history of smoking, a sort of cultural history of smoking in many ways. And we just did a really fascinating episode with her. I think that episode was hooked towards regulations to not allow people to smoke at work. And that was a really sort of fascinating moment. But go look that one up. It's a really, really interesting episode. And then on January 11th, 1989, after 8 years as president of the United States, Reagan gave his farewell address to the American people. In his speech, Reagan spoke about his foreign policy achievements first and foremost. And that kind of brought an end, I would say, in many ways to that Cold War era. Though I suppose this is a good moment to bring up that little tidbit of history that people like to trot out, which is that Reagan was not actually president when the Berlin Wall came down, right?
He was not president.
But it was, here we are in January, he steps down, and it's not until later in that fall that it actually comes down. So
East Germany was just waiting for Reagan to leave to topple their wall.
Is that right?
No.
All right, we will leave it there. Folks, sign up for our newsletter so you can get more of On This Days and more original analysis. We're going to relaunch the newsletter very soon. You can do that at thisdaypod.com, where you can also pick up some merch and get some other stuff. So that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From